Hello everyone, and welcome to ASMR Crime Chronicles. My name is Lydia, and tonight we'll be taking a calm, thoughtful look at another fascinating true crime mystery. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that the cases discussed on this channel involve real people and real families. The purpose of these videos is not to sensationalize tragedy, but to explore the facts, the investigations, and the unanswered questions that continue to surround these stories. So, get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. On the afternoon of July 24th, 1997, Amy Wroe Bechtel set out for a run in the mountains outside Lander, Wyoming. She was 24 years old, athletic, experienced, and deeply familiar with the rugged wilderness she loved to explore. She told her husband where she planned to run. Then she left. It was a normal summer day, a routine outing, one she had completed countless times before. But Amy never returned home. Her disappearance would trigger one of the largest search efforts in Wyoming history and leave investigators searching for answers that remain elusive more than 25 years later. Tonight, we'll explore the mystery of Amy Wroe Bechtel. To understand the mystery of Amy Wroe Bechtel, we first need to understand the person at the center of the story. By all accounts, Amy was energetic, intelligent, and adventurous. She loved the outdoors. She loved physical challenges, and she embraced the rugged landscapes of Wyoming in a way that seemed perfectly natural to those who knew her. Amy was born in 1972 and grew up with a deep appreciation for athletics and the natural world. Friends often described her as driven and determined. She was the type of person who set goals and worked tirelessly to achieve them. Whether it was academics, athletics, or personal pursuits, Amy approached life with enthusiasm. By the mid-1990s, she had settled in Wyoming. For many people, Wyoming represents freedom, towering mountain ranges, endless skies, remote wilderness areas stretching for miles. For Amy, it was home. She was particularly drawn to endurance sports. Running became more than a hobby. It became a passion. Long-distance runs through mountain trails and open landscapes allowed her to combine her love of fitness with her appreciation for the outdoors. Those who knew Amy understood that spending hours on remote trails wasn't unusual for her. In fact, it was often exactly where she wanted to be. She was confident in the wilderness, comfortable navigating difficult terrain, and experienced enough to handle conditions that might intimidate less seasoned runners. Amy was also newly married. She and her husband, Steve Bechtel, had built a life together in Lander, Wyoming. Friends described them as active and adventurous. They shared a love of the outdoors and often spent time exploring the region's mountains, trails, and rivers. To outside observers, Amy appeared to be entering an exciting chapter of her life. She was young, healthy, ambitious, and surrounded by opportunities. Nothing suggested that she was planning to disappear. Nothing suggested that she intended to leave behind the life she had built. As the summer of 1997 unfolded, Amy continued her active lifestyle. She trained regularly. She worked. She spent time with friends and family, and she looked forward to future adventures. Then came July 24th, a warm summer day that seemed completely ordinary, a day that began like countless others before it. But before the sun set, Amy Wroe Bechtel would vanish, and despite decades of investigation, no one has ever been able to explain exactly what happened. The last confirmed chapter of Amy's life was about to begin, and it started with a run through Wyoming's wilderness. On Thursday, July 24th, 1997, Amy Wroe Bechtel began her day like many others. There was nothing unusual about her plans, no indication that the day would become one of the most discussed dates in Wyoming's history. At 24 years old, Amy was in excellent physical condition. Running was a regular part of her routine. The mountains and trails surrounding Lander were familiar territory. For Amy, heading out alone for a run was not considered unusual or risky. It was simply part of her lifestyle. That afternoon, Amy planned to run in the Shoshone National Forest, an area known for its stunning scenery, rugged terrain, and extensive network of trails. The region attracts hikers, campers, hunters, and runners from across the country. Towering peaks rise above forests of pine and fir, mountain streams wind through valleys, and miles of trails disappear into remote wilderness. To many people, it is one of the most beautiful areas in Wyoming. Before leaving, Amy reportedly told her husband where she intended to run. The route would take her near Burnt Gulch, a rugged area northwest of Lander. It was a location she knew well. There was no reason for anyone to be concerned. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Amy was seen at a local photography store. She picked up some developed film. The visit was brief, ordinary, routine. No one noticed anything unusual about her behavior. She appeared relaxed and normal. It would become one of the final confirmed sightings of Amy. Sometime afterward, she drove toward the trail area where she intended to run. The summer weather was favorable. Conditions were ideal for outdoor recreation. The trails were accessible. Visibility was excellent. There were no storms threatening the region. Nothing about the environment suggested danger. For an experienced runner like Amy, it should have been an enjoyable afternoon. As the hours passed, however, something began to feel wrong. Amy failed to return home. Initially, there may have been reasonable explanations. Perhaps she had extended her run. Perhaps she had stopped to visit someone. Perhaps she had encountered a minor delay. But as evening approached, concern began to grow. For those who knew Amy, failing to return without explanation was highly unusual. She was dependable, responsible, and not known for disappearing unexpectedly. When she still had not returned later that evening, the situation became more serious. Her husband began attempting to locate her. Soon, attention turned towards the area where she had planned to run. Eventually, investigators discovered Amy's vehicle. It was parked near the trailhead. At first glance, there appeared to be nothing remarkable about it. The vehicle itself offered few clues. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no indication of an accident, no immediate evidence suggesting what had happened after Amy left the parking area. The discovery of the vehicle confirmed one important fact. Amy had reached her intended destination. She had arrived. She had likely begun her run. But somewhere after that point, the trail of known facts simply stopped. No confirmed witness could say exactly where she went. No one could describe her final movements. No one could explain why she never returned. The timeline narrowed to a frustratingly small window. Amy arrived in the area. She set out on her run, and then she vanished. For investigators, this created an enormous challenge. The wilderness surrounding Burnt Gulch covers a vast area. Mountain terrain can conceal clues for days, months, or even years. A single missed turn, an unexpected injury, a chance encounter, Any of these possibilities could dramatically alter the course of events, yet none of them could be proven. As darkness settled over the Wyoming mountains that evening, family members, friends, and authorities found themselves confronting a frightening reality. A healthy, experienced runner had disappeared, and nobody knew where to begin looking. What started as concern quickly transformed into urgency, because with every passing hour, the chances of finding Amy safely could begin to decrease. The following day, search efforts would begin in earnest. Volunteers, law enforcement officers, search and rescue teams, and aircraft would descend upon the region. What followed would become one of the largest missing person searches in Wyoming history. And despite the scale of that effort, the mountains would refuse to give up their answers. When Amy Wroe Bechtel failed to return home on July 24, 1997, concern quickly turned into action. Friends, family members, law enforcement officers, and volunteers all understood the same thing. If Amy was injured somewhere in the mountains, time mattered. The sooner she could be located, the greater the chances of bringing her home safely. Search efforts began almost immediately. At first, investigators focused on the most likely explanations. Perhaps Amy had become injured while running. Perhaps she had suffered a fall. Perhaps she was stranded somewhere in the rugged terrain and unable to reach help. These possibilities were serious, but they were also scenarios that search and rescue teams encounter regularly. The hope was that Amy would simply be found waiting for assistance. But as the search expanded, that hope became increasingly difficult to maintain. The area surrounding Burnt Gulch is both beautiful and challenging. Steep hills rise above winding trails. Dense patches of forest interrupt open meadows. Rocky outcroppings overlook deep valleys. And while the landscape can seem welcoming on a summer afternoon, it can quickly become overwhelming when someone is missing. Search teams began combing the area on foot. Volunteers walked trails. Investigators examined roads and pull-offs. Search dogs were brought in to assist. Aircraft surveyed the terrain from above. Every effort was made to locate even the smallest clue: a piece of clothing, a footprint, a dropped item, anything that might indicate where Amy had gone after beginning her run. As news of the disappearance spread, additional resources arrived. What had started as a local search evolved into a major operation. Hundreds of people would eventually participate. Experienced search and rescue personnel joined the effort. Helicopters scanned remote sections of wilderness. Horseback teams explored areas inaccessible to vehicles. The search area continued to grow. And yet, despite the enormous effort, investigators encountered a troubling problem. They found almost nothing. No confirmed trail. No clear evidence. No obvious indication of what had happened. In many missing person cases, search teams eventually uncover at least some clue that helps direct the investigation. A discarded water bottle, a personal item, a witness sighting, something. In Amy's case, those clues seemed remarkably absent. Days passed, then weeks. The search continued, but the mystery only deepened. For investigators, this created a frustrating paradox. On one hand, Amy was an experienced runner familiar with the area. On the other hand, experienced runners do not simply disappear without leaving evidence behind. The lack of clues became a clue in itself. People began asking difficult questions. If Amy had suffered an accident, Why hadn't searchers found signs of it? If she had become lost, why had no trace of her emerged? And if another explanation existed, what evidence supported it? The mountains remained silent. Searchers returned day after day, hoping each new effort would produce a breakthrough. Instead, they found themselves confronting the same unanswered question. Where was Amy Wroe Bechtel? As summer progressed, public attention intensified. Newspapers covered the story. Television stations reported updates. The disappearance captured the attention of people far beyond Wyoming. Many followed the case because it seemed so difficult to understand. A young woman had vanished during a routine run in broad daylight in an area that had been searched extensively. The situation seemed almost impossible, yet it was real. And as investigators continued searching for answers, another challenge emerged. Reports of possible sightings, potential witnesses, and information that seemed promising at first glance. Some of these leads generated excitement. Others led nowhere. But together, they would shape the next phase of the investigation. Because while search teams scoured the mountains, detectives began pursuing every clue they could find. And not all of those clues pointed toward the wilderness. Some pointed toward people who may or may not have crossed paths with Amy on the day she disappeared. As the search for Amy Wroe Bechtel continued, investigators faced a difficult reality. The initial effort had produced remarkably few answers. No clear trail, no obvious accident site, no personal belongings that could explain what had happened after she began her run. Yet despite the lack of physical evidence, information continued to arrive. Tips, witness reports, possible sightings. And like many missing person investigations, each new lead carried the possibility of a breakthrough. For family members and investigators alike, every phone call brought renewed hope. Perhaps someone had seen Amy. Perhaps a witness remembered an important detail. Perhaps the mystery was about to be solved. Unfortunately, many of those leads would eventually lead nowhere. One of the challenges investigators faced was the sheer number of people who had been in the area during the days surrounding Amy's disappearance. Summer is a busy season in Wyoming's outdoor recreation areas. Hikers, campers, fishermen, hunters, tourists. Many individuals traveled through the region every day. As detectives interviewed potential witnesses, they attempted to reconstruct a timeline of activity around Burnt Gulch. Who had been there? What had they seen? And most importantly, had anyone encountered Amy? Some witnesses reported seeing runners. Others recalled vehicles parked near trail access points. A few accounts seemed especially promising. But as investigators dug deeper, many details proved difficult to verify. Memories can be unreliable, particularly when people are asked to recall ordinary events days or weeks later. A person might remember seeing a woman running, but was it Amy? A vehicle might seem familiar, but was it actually connected to the case? The farther investigators looked into certain reports, the more uncertainty they encountered. Nevertheless, they continued following every lead. They had little choice. At that stage of the investigation, even the smallest clue could prove important. As public interest grew, tips began arriving from outside Wyoming as well. Some people believed they had seen Amy in another state. Others suggested entirely different explanations for her disappearance. Most of these reports could not be substantiated. Still, investigators reviewed them carefully. Experience had taught them that occasionally the most unexpected lead can become the most valuable. In Amy's case, however, the breakthrough never came. One particularly frustrating aspect of the investigation involved the absence of evidence where evidence should have existed. Amy was a runner. She would likely have been moving along established routes. If she had suffered an accident, searchers expected to find signs. If she had become lost, they expected to uncover some indication of her movements. Yet the wilderness seemed to have erased her presence entirely. This unusual lack of evidence caused some investigators to consider alternative possibilities. Perhaps the answer did not lie somewhere deep in the mountains. Perhaps something had occurred much closer to the trailhead. Perhaps another person had been involved. At that point, detectives began paying closer attention to everyone connected to the case: friends, acquaintances, witnesses, and individuals who had been in the area that day. This did not necessarily mean investigators suspected foul play. Good investigations require examining every possibility. And as time passed without answers, it became increasingly important to explore explanations beyond an accident in the wilderness. The challenge was that every path seemed to end in uncertainty. Witness accounts could not be confirmed. Physical evidence remained scarce. Search efforts continued producing few results. Months after Amy disappeared, investigators found themselves in nearly the same position they had occupied at the beginning. A young woman had vanished. No one knew where she was, and no one could say with confidence what had happened. For family members, the uncertainty was agonizing. For investigators, it was frustrating. And for the public, it transformed the case into something increasingly rare, a disappearance that seemed to leave almost no trace behind. But as detectives continued examining the evidence, attention gradually began shifting toward specific individuals, people whose names would become closely associated with the investigation. Some were considered witnesses, some were considered persons of interest, and some would become the subject of speculation for years to come. The next phase of the investigation would focus not on the wilderness itself, but on the people who might hold the answers. And that is where the case would become even more complicated. As months passed without answers, investigators found themselves confronting an uncomfortable reality. The wilderness search had produced little evidence. Witness reports had generated few breakthroughs, and Amy Wroe Bechtel remained missing. When a case reaches that point, investigators often broaden their focus. Instead of asking only where a person might be, they begin asking who might know more than they have revealed. That shift does not necessarily mean law enforcement believes a crime has occurred. Rather, it reflects the simple need to examine every possible explanation. In Amy's case, detectives began taking a closer look at the people connected to her life and the events surrounding her disappearance. One of the first individuals naturally examined was Amy's husband, Steve Bechtel. This is common in missing person investigations. Statistically, investigators often begin with those closest to the missing individual. Spouses, partners, relatives, and close friends are frequently interviewed extensively, not because they are automatically suspects, but because they often possess the most information. Steve cooperated with investigators and publicly maintained his desire to find answers regarding his wife's disappearance. Over the years, however, speculation inevitably emerged. As happens in many high-profile missing person cases, Some members of the public questioned whether investigators had overlooked something. Others believed there was no evidence pointing toward him at all. Despite years of scrutiny, no charges were ever filed against Steve Bechtel in connection with Amy's disappearance. As the investigation continued, detectives examined additional individuals who had been in the area around the time Amy vanished. Among them was a local man whose name would become closely associated with the case in later years. The individual reportedly had a history that attracted investigative attention and had been linked by some observers to unusual incidents in the region. Certain aspects of his background caused law enforcement to take a closer look. Yet despite considerable discussion and public speculation, investigators were unable to establish evidence sufficient to resolve the case. For many people following the mystery, this became a recurring pattern. An individual would attract attention, questions would emerge, theories would develop, then the evidence would fall short of providing definitive answers. As a result, uncertainty continued to dominate the investigation. Over time, several major theories began to emerge. The first remained the wilderness accident theory. Supporters of this explanation believe Amy may have suffered an injury while running, a fall, a medical emergency, or some other unexpected event. The Wyoming wilderness is vast. Search efforts can be extensive and still miss critical evidence. There are documented cases in which missing persons have remained undiscovered despite repeated searches. Those who favor this theory argue that the simplest explanation may ultimately be the correct one. Yet many people struggle with that conclusion. The scale of the search effort was enormous. Hundreds of individuals participated. Aircraft surveyed the terrain. Search dogs were deployed. If Amy had suffered an accident near her intended route, some observers believe evidence should have been located. This skepticism gave rise to another theory, that Amy encountered another person, perhaps someone she knew, perhaps someone she did not. Under this scenario, the disappearance was not caused by the wilderness itself, but by an interaction that occurred after she began her run. Supporters of this theory often point to the absence of physical evidence, the lack of belongings, the lack of confirmed sightings, and the lack of a clear trail leading away from the area. However, while the theory remains possible, investigators have never publicly identified evidence sufficient to establish exactly what such an encounter might have involved. Then there is a third possibility, one that exists somewhere between the first two. Perhaps a chance event occurred that investigators simply could not reconstruct, a circumstance so unusual that it left little evidence behind, an unexpected sequence of events that no one anticipated and no one witnessed. The challenge with mysteries like Amy's is that the farther one moves from established facts, the more uncertainty enters the picture. And uncertainty has surrounded this case from the very beginning. Years became decades. Investigators continued reviewing information. New tips occasionally surfaced. Public interest remained strong. Yet the central question never changed. What happened after Amy left on that run? The answer remained hidden somewhere beyond the reach of investigators. And because no definitive explanation emerged, the disappearance of Amy Wroe Bechtel gradually became one of Wyoming's most enduring mysteries. A mystery built not only upon what was known, but upon everything that remained unknown. And after years of investigation, discussion, and speculation, the case still returned to the same fundamental question. If none of the theories fully explain the disappearance, what conclusion could be drawn from the evidence that remained? That question would define the final chapter of Amy's story. More than 2 decades have passed since Amy Wroe Bechtel disappeared on a summer afternoon in Wyoming. In that time, investigators have reviewed evidence, search teams have revisited the terrain, journalists have examined the case, and countless individuals have studied the mystery, hoping to uncover the answer that has remained hidden for so long. Yet despite those efforts, the disappearance of Amy Wroe Bechtel remains unsolved. Perhaps what makes this case so compelling is its simplicity. Unlike many mysteries, there is no complicated timeline involving dozens of witnesses. There is no lengthy trail of evidence stretching across multiple states. There are no definitive clues pointing clearly in one direction. Instead, there is a young woman who went for a run and never came home. The facts themselves are remarkably straightforward. Amy arrived in the area. She began her run. Her vehicle was found, and then the trail of confirmed information simply ends. Everything beyond that point exists in a space occupied by theories, possibilities, and unanswered questions. For many people, the wilderness accident theory remains the most likely explanation. Nature can be unpredictable. Even experienced outdoors enthusiasts sometimes encounter circumstances they cannot overcome. The mountains surrounding Lander are beautiful, but they are also vast. Supporters of this theory believe the answer may still lie somewhere within that landscape, waiting to be discovered. Others remain unconvinced. The extensive search effort seems difficult to reconcile with a simple accident. If Amy suffered an injury near her intended route, why was no evidence located? Why were no belongings discovered? Why did such a massive operation fail to uncover more clues? Thus, questions continue to trouble many observers. Then there are those who believe another person may have been involved, not because definitive evidence proves it, but because the absence of evidence itself feels unusual. The lack of answers creates a void, and where uncertainty exists, alternative explanations naturally emerge. Yet even after years of investigation, no theory has succeeded in resolving every question. Each explanation appears to account for some details, while leaving others unexplained. Perhaps that is why the case continues to attract attention. It resists certainty. The mystery remains balanced between multiple possibilities, and none of them fully satisfies the evidence available. For Amy's family and loved ones, however, the case has never been an intellectual puzzle. It has always been personal. Behind every discussion of theories and investigations is the reality that a daughter, wife, friend, and member of a community disappeared. The uncertainty that surrounds the case is not merely frustrating, it is enduring. Every unsolved case leaves questions behind, but some leave more questions than answers. Amy Wroe Bechtel's disappearance is one of those cases, a story that begins with a routine afternoon, a familiar trail, a summer run through the Wyoming wilderness, and then a silence that has lasted for decades. Perhaps someday new information will emerge. Perhaps advances in technology will reveal something investigators could not see in 1997. Perhaps a witness will come forward, or perhaps the answer has been hidden within the Wyoming landscape all along. Unfortunately, no one can say with certainty, and so the mystery remains. A young runner leaves for an afternoon run. A vehicle waits at a trailhead. A search begins. and the question that has echoed since July 24th, 1997, remains unanswered. What happened to Amy Wroe Bechtel? As we bring this story to a close, that question remains for each of us to consider, and perhaps that is why the case continues to endure, not because of what we know, but because of everything we still do not. As with many mysteries, we may never know the complete truth. What we do know is that a life was forever changed. Loved ones were left searching for answers, and a case that began with unanswered questions continues to inspire discussion years later. Thank you for joining me for this episode of ASMR Crime Chronicles. If you enjoyed this calm exploration of a true crime mystery, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening. Good night.